Good evening. My name is Onika Williams, and I am chair of the National Bar Association Young Lawyers Division. The National Bar Association was founded in 1925 and is the nation's oldest and largest national network of predominantly African-American attorneys and judges. The YLD is the home of the young lawyer within the NBA and represents the interests of young Black attorneys under the age of 40 years old or originally admitted to practice within the past 10 years, whichever is more inclusive. This year's NBA YLD theme, 2020 and Beyond, recognizing the importance of the young lawyer, will be seen throughout 7 programmatic areas. 1, election protection, voter registration, and education. 2, COVID-19 recovery efforts. 3, efforts to eliminate police brutality. 4, 2020 census efforts and 2021 redistricting efforts. 5, professional and skills development. 6, mental health and wellness. And 7, pipeline programs and mentorship opportunities. We are so excited to have you here tonight. Welcome to the launch of NBA YLD's redistricting project, The People's Map. Tonight, we are kicking off our redistricting work with a foundational webinar led by experts called Redistricting 101. You will learn what redistricting is, why redistricting is important, and more. So feel free to have others join us and use the hashtags hashtag the people's map and hashtag NBA YLD redistricting on social media. Now we will turn it over to NBA YLD's Legislative Committee Co-Chair, Jennifer Blemur. Jennifer?
Thanks, Onika, and thank you everyone for logging on with us today. I'm Jennifer Blemur, and I'm one half of the Legislative Affairs team for the Young Lawyers Division for National Bar Association. I want to take a moment to welcome our panelists who are going to be providing information on redistricting and also anti-gerrymandering. Each of our panelists will spend up to 5 minutes talking about their different areas. Then we'll go into a question and answer section. And then we'll also pitch it over to the audience members so you all can ask your questions and get them answers. It's after 5 o'clock, so feel free to be casual. I know we're all like dressed up. I have not seen outside for quite some time, so don't feel free to like loosen up a little bit because we are talking about something that is incredibly important, but we want to make sure that folks are engaged with us. And so I'll just do a quick introduction of our panelists. We have Christopher Lamar, who is legal counsel at the Campaign Legal Center. Madiba Dennie, who is counsel for the Democracy Department at the Brennan Center. Craine, who is chair of the Redistricting Committee for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated and past NBA YLD chair. And finally, Jack Noland, who is a research manager with RepresentUs. So thank you all for being here. And I will start off the panel with Chris Lamar, who will provide us with an overview of redistricting.
Sure, thanks Jennifer. So like the redistricting process really actually starts with the census. And so like the census is just, putting in, basically counting everyone who lives in the country, right? And once we have that data, basically once we know how many people live in the country, the next step is there's sort of 2 things that can happen. The first thing that can happen is what we call reapportionment, which is sort of basically just telling the states, here's how many representatives in US Congress, in the House of Representatives that you get. But then on the other side, there's the redistricting process, which is, giving the data to the states to say, you can now draw the lines for legislative, which is like the state level districts for like, the state level House of Representatives, the state level Senate if they have it. States like Nebraska actually only has one house of the legislature. And so once the state has this data, then it's the process of drawing the lines, right? And in most states, the state legislature is actually the body that's responsible for drawing these lines, but in some other states, there's the process of what we call independent redistricting commissions that are responsible for drawing these lines. And so like in Michigan, for example, it's actually a body of 14 people who are Democrats, Republicans, and independents who are responsible for drawing the lines. And they have to have meetings and they have to follow a certain amount of guidelines under state law in drawing this process. With the state legislature, depending on the state, it can vary from, every state has to follow the US Constitution, right? But all of the states don't necessarily have to follow other things that we would like to see in terms of, ensuring stronger minority protections. The Voting Rights Act, for example, actually has a decent amount of protections in it, but there's like some concern about that with this current Supreme Court. And so there's just various ways that, the spectrum of drawing fair maps like across this country can range from, very strong protections to almost kind of non-existent and very high reliance on federal law to sort of do that process.
Thank you. So I'm going to move to Madiba Dennie, who is going to provide an overview of some of the legal challenges and like what the legal landscape of redistricting has been since the Shelby County case.
Hello, everyone. My name is Madiba Dennie, and I'm a counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. My work as an attorney at the Brennan Center focuses generally on fair representation in our political process, and more specifically, I work on issues related to the decennial census, which Chris just explained provides the data which we use to redraw maps for congressional and state legislative districts. Before I dive in, I would like to first say thank you to the National Bar Association Young Lawyers Division for inviting me to be a panelist tonight. And I would like to thank you, the audience, for choosing to spend your valuable pandemic time with us. So I'm going to use this time to talk a bit about the legal landscape of redistricting and how lawyers can get involved in this fight. An important thing to understand about the redistricting landscape is that the terrain is vast and varied. There are very few federal constraints, so you can basically have as many redistricting systems as there are states. The major parameters as established by the Constitution and other federal law are districts should have substantially equal populations, each congressional district elects one representative, and communities of color must have an equal opportunity to elect the candidate of their choice. But beyond these requirements, states have a lot of legal leeway in determining the process for how maps get drawn and what those maps look like. This leeway is often abused as groups try to manipulate maps to allocate political power as they see fit. And this upcoming round of redistricting is particularly ripe for shenanigans. Since the last redistricting cycle a decade ago, the Supreme Court has made two major rulings that make redistricting harder for those of us who are concerned about a functioning multiracial democracy. As Jennifer cited, the first one is Shelby versus Holder. Prior to the Supreme Court's 2013 ruling in Shelby, the Voting Rights Act subjected states and localities with the worst histories of voter discrimination to additional federal oversight, requiring that they get approval from the Department of Justice or the DC District Court before they could make any changes to their voting practices or procedures, which includes redistricting. This pre-clearance requirement was important because it shifted the burden from folks being discriminated against to the governments doing the discriminating, and it blocked literally thousands of shady would-be policy changes in their tracks. In its lawsuit, Shelby County, Alabama challenged the legality of the pre-clearance formula, basically saying, hey now, we haven't been racist in a really long time, and this is unfair to us. Justice Roberts led a majority of the court in being like, you're right, things have changed, we have a Black president now, we don't need this pre-clearance formula anymore. The late, great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg strongly disagreed, noting that this was like throwing out your umbrella in a rainstorm because you weren't getting wet. But she was unfortunately in the minority. So this redistricting cycle will be the first in decades without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. Yeah, you're not surprising that this racism was on the clock, but here that's what we were told. So yes, this now would create opportunities for mischief, like drawing maps that split up voters of color in ways that make it harder for us to elect our preferred candidates, or perhaps delaying completing redistricting in order to limit the time for litigating any challenges brought under other laws. The other Supreme Court ruling I want to flag for you all tonight is Ruscho versus Common Cause. The plaintiffs in that case filed suit challenging their state's congressional districting maps as unconstitutional partisan gerrymanders. Courts have been struggling for a while now to establish a workable standard for determining how partisan is too partisan for a district map. And the Supreme Court answered this question by throwing its hands up in the air and saying there is no workable standard. The court recognized that partisan gerrymandering is harmful and anti-democratic, sure, but it concluded that it's a political issue that federal courts lack the authority to address. The majority opinion here, written again by John Roberts, was essentially a very eloquent shrug emoji. So, to summarize, states can basically do what they want as long as they promise with a wink and a nudge not to be too racist, and the federal courts won't intervene. But now that I've described some of the problems, I do want to put you on to some potential solutions. Namely, we can still use the laws we do have and fight for better ones. Despite the nonsense we've seen at the federal level, we have also seen some wins at the state level in the past few years. Pennsylvania and North Carolina, for example, both had successful challenges under their individual state constitutions, which could have stronger protections than that in the federal level, which always sort of sets the floor rather than the ceiling. So it is a possibility that we can pursue cases in state courts, which don't get as much attention, but there's a lot that goes down there. Lawyers can also use public hearing laws and freedom of information laws to try shine a light on some processes that otherwise thrive on a lack of transparency and obfuscation. And as far as creating new laws, there's a lot of advocacy right now behind HR 1/S1, the For the People Act, as well as HR 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act would give us a formula again for pre-clearance, as I described with Shelby. And the For the People Act has a range of anti-gerrymandering methods in the bill, such as that would establish standards across the country, like using independent commissions instead of letting states sort of draw maps as they see fit and then trying to increase their own political power. So while these problems do certainly exist, there's a lot of room for lawyers to get involved, especially if we work with people who are already doing that work on the ground. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of variance between different state practices, and so it would be very useful to sort of partner with people who already know what's going on in their state and who can speak about what that community needs. It could be strategy guidance on preparing testimony, or it could be like helping get ready for those hearings, or helping demand public hearings in the first place if the state's avoiding doing so. But basically, as attorneys, we have a responsibility to try and make sure that we actually do live in like a country of laws, and that those laws apply to all of us. So there is work to be done, but we can do it.
Thank you for sharing, Madiba. I want to pull out 2 points that or 2 words rather that you mentioned during your section, was the advocacy and anti-gerrymandering, and I think those are good lead up for our other 2 panelists. I'm going to now transition over to Khyla for her to discuss some of her work engaging constituents on redistricting.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And thank you to the YLD for continuing the great work that you have done all year long, and to our incomparable chair, Onika, you have done a fabulous work, and to our co-chair, Jennifer, thank you so much for pulling this all together. And so, yes, I'm Khyla Craine. I have the pleasure of chairing redistricting for Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. If you don't know what Delta is, you can go to deltasigmatheta.org. Learn more about our wonderful 108-year organization. But we stand on the principle of social action. And so as a member of the National Social Action Commission for Delta, we're split up into committees, and I have the pleasure of leading our redistricting efforts. And as Chris said, we have been in Delta going in a 3-year arc. So we started in 2018, making sure that all of our members understood the importance of voting in that quote unquote midterm election, because often the persons who won those gubernatorial elections in 2018 would be the ones who will be signing into law the redistricting plans that will go into effect this year. And then we moved through 2020 so that we can get engaged on the federal elections in that year, as well as the gubernatorial elections that were happening in 2020 and in 2019, to be honest. But we also had a concerted effort around census, and I had the pleasure of leading the sororities efforts on the census as well. And so we went across the country to all of our hundreds of chapters on the collegiate as well as alumni level. We're in all 50 states, and making sure that sorors understood the importance of the census, why it's important for us to be counted accurately the first time, how that impacts both money, power, and access to our elected officials. And then now we have begun our work on redistricting. And so it is important for us to make sure that the members of our sorority, as well as the communities that they serve, understand the impact of redistricting and why it is so very important. And while the census was a little bit easier to grasp because we borrowed from our friend Lil Kim, money, power, respect, that's a little bit easier and sexy to understand with the census. Redistricting is very nuanced, as Chris and Madiba have illuminated already, and Jack probably will do so as well following myself. It's so many different systems. You have redistricting on the federal and state level by the state legislatures or independent citizens redistricting commission like we have here in my home state of Michigan. But then on the local level too, people don't understand that redistricting happens for city councils and county councils and maybe even a water district, depending upon how granular it gets in your state. So we're doing a series of events. We have Redistricting 101, 201, and 301. We have Redistricting Tuesdays, so twice a month. We're engaging on Twitter, and we're going to be launching something very soon to continue to engage our members on redistricting. Prior to moving back home to Michigan, I was Assistant General Counsel for the NAACP. And so with my background there, it's really important for us to make sure that the folks on the ground who all of these redistricting plans will intricately impact, understand that we need to make sure that we get it right the first time, because fixing it, making sure that we get it right the first time is a lot easier than doing some of the work that Madiba talked about, which is suing states and municipalities on the back end for discriminatory maps. So this looks like, as she indicated, and forgive me if that's not your pronouns, but that it would be engaging on testimony, making sure that you know how to write testimony that will adhere or that would illuminate the concerns that you have for your community, making sure that community members who have been there for a long time can tell you about the history of said community, and to so talk about the shifts in population. If the community was once on the west side and now they're on the east side, or they're maybe even outside of the city limits but are in our township or a village, we need to know that so that we can draw those maps appropriately. As well as being able to testify. What are you going to say? How are you going to say it? How are you going to say it cleanly and clearly so that elected officials understand what you're trying to say and why it's important? And then also determining whether or not you want to put up an alternative map, and making sure that you're able to work with demographers and other experts so that you can present a map that can clearly indicate the needs of the Black community. All of those things are important to folks on the ground, but they typically need lawyers in some form or fashion to help them along the way. And this is exactly why it's so important for the Young Lawyers Division to get involved with this, because working together, both with the community as well as with lawyers, they can be able to write out these testimonies, write out these oral arguments, certainly, so that you can get the best maps that you can on the front end. And then, of course, unfortunately, if we do have to sue, which is so much harder now that the Supreme Court has gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, we'll need local attorneys to participate in the Section 2 suits that are long, expensive, and tedious, to be honest, so that we can get the maps that we deserve. So that's a little bit about the work that we're doing with Delta, and why it's so important that the YID get involved, and love to answer more questions as we go along.
Awesome. Thank you, Khyla. And then finally, I'm going to have Jack sort of talk about, again, that advocacy part that RepresentUs is doing and some of the work that they're doing on anti-gerrymandering efforts, and even have you explain a little bit like what is gerrymandering for folks who may not know.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I want to thank my fellow panelists. It's really an honor to get to speak on this panel. It is such an important issue right now because gerrymandering and the fight for fair maps is so important. So gerrymandering broadly refers to the act of drawing political districts to advantage one group over another. There's a long and sordid history of racial gerrymandering in this country, of course, and the partisan gerrymandering that the Supreme Court has largely unrestricted to this point, or at this point, has sort of joined that effort. And they're often they often go hand in hand. So when we think about the work of anti-gerrymandering and Represent Us and elsewhere, I really think that the Madiba kind of hit on the central divide here. So there's two buckets. There's changing the systems and then using those systems to ensure that the maps are fair and representative. So one of the side effects of the delay in the census data being available is that advocates really do have some more time to try to improve some of these redistricting systems. You know, it's a 50-state process. So the New Mexico legislature, for example, just passed a bill that is going to put in place a stronger independent commission, advisory commission. So the clock is ticking, but there might be efforts to, or engage sort of, or there might be opportunities to engage in those sort of efforts around the country on the state level. At the federal level, as my fellow panelists have discussed, the For the People Act, which recently passed the House and actually has a hearing tomorrow in the Senate Rules Committee. So definitely worth following along. There's going to be testimony from the Brennan Center and Campaign Legal Center. So shout out to Madiba and Chris's teams. Because Congress has the ability to set these baseline federal standards, the bill really could overhaul this process and require a system that's much less prone to gerrymandering in all 50 states. Along with HR 4, it's a hugely important step toward moving toward fair maps, not as an ideal, but as a baseline standard that states have to adhere to. So getting involved in that fight and in pushing for strong federal standards is really, I think, one of the best ways that folks can get involved, especially lawyers who have a really good grasp of the redistricting reality and how thorny and complex it can be. We know that there are improvements that states can make to strengthen their redistricting criteria, to explicitly ban gerrymandering, protect communities, ensure more equitable representation, fill in a lot of those gaps, as Chris and Madiba were discussing. We also know that these systems can be set up to remove the role of incumbent officials who are often incentivized to pick their own voters. So there's a real opportunity there. So that's the first avenue. The second, which Khyla did a really good job of explaining, is using the system once the redistricting process starts. I love the way of framing it around, we have to get this right the first time so that we don't have to go to the ultimate step, which is litigation. It's often the last check on would-be gerrymanderers. I think the opportunity and the challenge is that redistricting is a 50-state process. So in every one of these states, there's going to be an opportunity to get involved, but also, you know, an opportunity for kind of heinous gerrymandering. Before we get to the litigation stage, there are, as we mentioned, a ton of opportunities for public hearings around redistricting. Some states even allow for public map submissions, which I think really are one of the best tools in the arsenal for public pressure. The general argument being that if advocates can generate fair maps, which they can and do, then the legislature or redistricting authority should be able to do the same. Some of those tools, which I can put in the chat after a conversation here, really allow folks to draw the lines block by block around the communities in their area, especially the racial, ethnic, cultural communities that are at risk of being split apart as the Voting Rights Act restrictions have been lifted. I'd also note, and I defer to the attorneys here on the details, but this kind of public testimony and these map submissions are really vital for building the public record for those future legal challenges. There are a ton of groups that are working on this. The Southern Coalition for Social Justice, for example, spread out across a number of Southern states and training folks to do this kind of record building, training the trainer, getting folks used to using these tools, advocating, pressuring the legislators and officials who are drawing these lines themselves can be really important as well. It's going to be challenging and contentious, and every incentive for a lot of these officials is to draw lines that protect their power, but it really is important to use the available avenues that we have now to push back on that. Gerrymandering, as Madiba put, really does depend on these structures of domination and a secretive process. And so pushing back on those things in any way that we can is really essential.
Thank you for sharing that, Jack. So I want to go into the questions that I pulled together, and as all of you were talking, it kind of sparked some questions in me. So I may ask one that I did not send you all last night, so be ready. First question. So that now that we've discussed redistricting, what is important for voters to know about how COVID has impacted the process? You all have discussed sort of a truncated census period and like how essential the census is to redistricting. What is something that voters really need to understand about the process and how it's been impacted? And I'll start with Chris.
Sure. So I think, I think the first step is to sort of realize in a lot of states, there are deadlines for basically they're saying, in the state where the legislature draws the maps, for example, it says if the state legislature hasn't drawn a map by X date, then the map drawing process goes to it could be what we call a backup commission. And so it can be like, I think in Texas, for example, it's like the governor and the 4 leaders of the state legislature are responsible for the map drawing process, right? In other places, there's just sort of other ways that like the map drawing process is affected by the census delay. And so, for example, I don't know how much people know about this, but the census data is actually supposed to come out in the normal non-pandemic year, supposed to come out by the end of this month. But because of the pandemic, it's actually not going to come out until, I think the most recent data is that the Census Bureau is not going to be able to release the redistricting data until September. There's some hope that they're going to be able to release the reapportionment data maybe a little bit earlier in April or so. And so because the deadline because states won't receive this data until September, and then you're talking about drawing the maps and giving people time to participate in the map drawing process, giving people time to consider whether or not they actually want to run for those seats and those types of things. It's it'll be truncated into this very, very tight deadline. And so that's really the main problem, is that in a lot of places, the time that people will have to sort of go to the things that Jack was talking about, where we're talking about giving people the opportunity to testify and sort of maybe shed light on politicians doing things that maybe they shouldn't be doing, will be a much, much tighter deadline. And they'll have this excuse, right, to say that oh, well, we have so much less time. So that's the reason why we're not going to have a ton of public hearings around this. So that's the reason why we're just releasing this map that we drew in secret and are bringing to the floor on a Monday and are voting on it on a Tuesday kind of thing. So.
Thank you. And Khyla, because you've been doing that work, working with, again, constituents, could you also answer that question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jennifer. In addition to what Chris illuminated, there are at least two gubernatorial races here, as well as state legislative races this year, and they need to be able to redraw their maps in order so that they can vote on those new members of the state legislature. And now they're not going to be able to do that. So you're going to be voting on people drawn in maps that are old. And whether they were problematic or not, it still is an issue that you're going to be electing people on old maps. I think New Jersey has elections this year. Virginia has. Thank you very much. Yep, both of those states have elections this year, and so you're going to be drawing those on old maps. The additional issue is that I think, as Chris was saying, that we're going into a federal election next year, so we need to get the maps drawn so people can decide whether or not they're going to run. A big part of that is, where do you live? Are you living in a district that you want to run in and you think that you can win in? And people will make those decisions typically at the beginning of next year. But if you don't know where you live, as far as the district is concerned, it hampers the process. Here in my home state, the Constitution requires for the new Citizens Redistricting Commission to put in their maps by November. Many states have it enshrined in their constitutions and not just their state statutes when those maps are supposed to be drawn. And so that sets up a whole host of issues where people are basically going to have to sue the state to change the Constitution, because you just can't change the Constitution on a whim. But I will say, for us in Delta, the delay has given us an extra few months for us to get our constituents prepared. So we're trying to see the goodness out of this delay, is saying that we have an extra 4 months to get you all educated about redistricting. We have an extra 4 months to prepare you on how to testify for these before these commissions and legislatures, and so that when because we expect that when the data is dropped, they're going to rush and try to get this done, and we will be ready for that time whenever it does happen. So we're trying to see the forest in the trees, or however that saying goes, the good part of it.
Thank you. My next question is, what are you most concerned about in the upcoming redistricting process? And I'll start off with Madiba.
Okay. I think Khyla raised a point that I'm really concerned about, which is what if states or localities try to use old maps, or really, I guess, any sort of alternative data set, in that they might try to do something that really just doesn't reflect the actual population that lives there. And I think this is particularly concerning for communities of color, which have greater population growth. I think Latino populations and Asian populations in particular are growing pretty rapidly. And if we use older maps, that might not, actually that definitely will not be reflected in those, and it would distribute political power in a way that doesn't actually match where people live and how many people are there. So I think that's something that I find particularly concerning, just because you want power to go to the people and to the amounts of people, the amounts of power. And I do think that's also an important concern about whether they would try to limit public participation. And something I want to flag, similar to the population growth, is that with the census issues in the first place, from COVID and natural disasters and just a whole heap of things that happen, that's really the sort of the first opportunity to introduce inequality into redistricting, if people get left out of the census there. So that's another one of my concerns about, how many people were missed, and how many people were missed, and also which people were missed, because it could be that 90% of the population we actually got, but it was 100% of white people and some super low percent of Asian people, for example. So that's something that concerns me. I will note, though, that there was a lot of litigation and other advocacy on the parts of the census stakeholders that did get more time for the census and thus be able to get more responses. So hopefully some of that has been accommodated for. All of this is a roundabout way of saying that my big concern is just not actually measuring the amount of people, and those people then getting deprived of power.
Thank you. And then Jack, same questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is such a good point, Madiba. And I would say, the removal of the pre-clearance requirements is just really kind of makes it a huge unknown how these states are going to proceed. The other thing that I would flag is that technology has just gotten so much more advanced than 2011. I think in 2011 I had a flip phone. The ability to craft these terrible maps at varying degrees of terribleness is so much easier by the mapping software that these redistricting authorities have at their disposal. And so if the systems allow these folks to draw maps that prop up their advantage, they will do it with surgical precision. And so it's going to make the task of fighting for fair maps that much harder, I think.
Thank
Can
you.
I add something really quick, Jennifer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Kind of going to the point that 50 states, 50 ways. Each state can decide how they want to count people on the state level. So they can use total population, they can use citizen population or citizen voting age population or something of that nature to draw lines. The state of Alabama has kind of floated that they don't want to use total population. There's a case called Evanwell that the Supreme Court basically says that states can do what you want. You can choose total population or citizen voting age population, whichever. The problem with that is that people could decide to not count undocumented folks in how they're drawing the lines, which will falsely inflate a certain area if you have less amount or more amount of undocumented people. The other issue that Jack raised earlier is prison gerrymandering. And unfortunately, too many states have not ended the practice of gerrymandering, particularly when the prisons are set out in very rural areas, and that falsely inflates. And I'm sure we'll get to that a little bit later to dive into that more. But those two things combined can potentially set up a problem, along with the other issues that Madiba already eliminated, with the issue around the census and how it was constructed, and really trying to target immigrant communities in particular to not complete the census, which messes up the accuracy of the numbers from the start.
Thank you. So, once these lines are drawn or redrawn, however you want to call it, what should residents be prepared for? Are there any major issues that could be impacted by these redrawn lines? And Khyla, since you started, I'll just have you start off this round of question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say please don't wait until the lines are drawn to start like advocating about the maps for the reasons that I said earlier. But once the lines are drawn, we definitely need to scrutinize them very closely to see if they split communities of color, communities of interest, if they pack them in too few districts. Splitting is called cracking, packing is packing. And could there have been a majority people of color district or an opportunity district? Those are two different types of things. One is that there is a majority of Black and Brown people in a particular district. The other is that they may not be a majority, but they have a great opportunity to influence who is going to be elected from that district. And there needs to be scrutiny to determine whether or not those could have been taken place. For example, in the 3rd Congressional District in Virginia, the NAACP worked very hard with the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, our friends based in North Carolina, to determine that that congressional district had too many Black people in it for them. It packed too many Black people unnecessarily. There was no good reason why it was so large, and they could have been in a neighboring district to be an opportunity district for that one and a majority minority district in CD3. So we were able to sue and be able to create the districts that were more fair. But that took time. And I believe that started after Shelby County, which means it had to be under Section 2. So those are the things that you would have to kind of look for to see, were they done fairly? Do we need to sue? And if we do need to sue, you're going to have to scramble really quickly to get the legal counsel that you need, to get the data and the facts that you need to prove why these maps are discriminatory.
Thank you. And then Jack, could you also just briefly answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I would say redistricting is so foundational for the work that we all try to do in terms of creating a fairer democracy. And so, the worst version is once these lines are redrawn, these maps are put into existence, and then it really has to go to the courts. And that's where, I would just say that like the legal strategies have to be really tight in terms of really identifying, as Khyla mentioned, where these worst gerrymanders are, where the lines are unnecessarily breaking communities of interest and racial communities apart, and sort of what the best advocacy strategy is around that. I think there's going to be a component of this where, again, because this process is so secretive, like the bad maps that are drawn can't just be in the courts. It has to be in the court of public opinion. We need to, really kind of put these things in the limelight, because the opportunity to really rectify them before we have elections using these new maps, particularly in an environment where the census has compressed that timeline, is going to be slim. And so it's going to require a lot of work, but I'm confident that we can do it.
Thank you. And that's actually a really good transition for the two attorneys on here. I have a question about what should young attorneys anticipate in terms of legal objections. It sounds like you've called all the young attorneys that are watching right now to help in this effort. I am overcommitted, so I will be there in spirit and not in body. But what are some of the legal objections they should be thinking about going into if they do want to help with this endeavor? And I'll start with Madiba.
Sure. Well, one thing I think attorneys should be concerned about was just mentioned, which is Evanwell. There was a Supreme Court case, I want to say nearly 60 years ago, that held that districts in state legislatures, should be roughly equal population. But it seems that what that population is now sort of up for a debate, like more so than it's been in the past, I think. It's been generally accepted that the population is total population because your elected officials represent people, not land or acres or trees, but people. So it should be considering who are all the people who live here. But instead, we're seeing a lot of places now try to push this dangerous theory that we should be able to use subsets of the population, such as only citizens or even only citizens of voting age, which would really make the amount of people, or rather like the group of people that map drawing is based off of much older and whiter. So which would have, varying political leanings. And so there are some incentives for why some partisans may want that. So I think that's definitely something that attorneys should be on the lookout for and advance the argument that no, actually, we should be like equal representation requires representing all of the people. And another thing to be concerned about as well, even before we get to the map drawing stage, would be the timeline. I know folks had mentioned the impact of COVID, and we're seeing some of that already with the states suing to say they should be able to get the redistricting data, like on the normal non-pandemic schedule, which of course is not really a good idea because like it's already been like less time than the Census Bureau would have had to like accurately gather the data and like go process that data. And so you don't want to give out some raggedy, like incorrect data and district based off that. Like that's good for nobody. So I'll say that's another thing for attorneys to be concerned about.
Thank you. And Chris, before you answer, I just wanted to make a note to everybody watching. If you do have a question, feel free to pop it into the chat because we'll be taking audience questions. But go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, sure. I think sort of going back to like Jack's point about doing stuff on the front end, I don't know if folks have ever looked at like legislative testimony that people have submitted. Like I think having lawyers submit that stuff and sort of making it in a way that's actually like digestible and understandable for in like the state legislature or to independent redistricting commission, I think is very important. Like I have looked at the legislative I've looked at testimony people have submitted to the California Redistricting Commission, for example. And it's a mess. Like it doesn't like I've read a couple hundred pages and I was just like, I had a headache and it's not particularly helpful. And so I just think having lawyers who can kind of look at the California Constitution, for example, and kind of have an understanding of what the commission like has to do and what they're required to do, and then be able to break down and say, this is where community of interest is because of X, Y, and Z reasons, I think would be very, very helpful. Additionally, I think it would be helpful for lawyers to really do a lot of the freedom of information law stuff. And so sort of getting the information that, would only be discoverable during litigation, but getting that beforehand, before the maps are drawn and being able to write in those requests, I think is another way that I think lawyers could actually play a significant role. I just want to jump back really quickly. I guess it's not really quickly, but like, because that answers my question. But since there aren't any other questions yet, one thing I do want to say is that like, I think it's really important to remember that there's sort of this difference between like what is good for like the people of a state versus like what is good for the politicians of that state, right? And so they're like in the 2011 cycle, there were really good examples of, quite frankly, Black politicians, like Black Democrats working in tandem with white Republicans who were drawing these very, very packed African-American districts. And the reason why these Black Democrats were okay with that was because, if I'm a Black politician living in like pick whatever, it doesn't really matter what state, but like if I live in a very black part of a state that may not be that Black, giving me, the politician, a 90% Black voting age district is very helpful for me because it helps, like it lets me know that I'm always going to have a job, right? But that's not necessarily what the people of like my district want. That's not necessarily what the people like who shouldn't be in my district, quite frankly, would also want. So that's always another thing to sort of think about in terms of the stakeholders who are involved in this map drawing process.
Thank you. I feel like you said some people need to resign in grace.
I have thoughts.
Listen, some do, some don't. We don't know. We don't know, but I hope that they heard it and like will internalize it. I have one more question before we switch over to audience questions, and it sort of kind of came from just the comments of everybody on the panel. It's going to get like a little political, just like a tunch political. With shifting demographics, as you all have mentioned, and attempts from the Trump administration to prevent undocumented individuals from being counted, how imperative, and just general other shenanigans and foolery at the state and federal level, how imperative is it for marginalized groups, underrepresented groups, to be engaged in this work? And I'll start with you, Khyla.
It is essential. I can't underscore, bold, italicize, highlight that enough. It is critical for us as marginalized groups to be involved with this, because this connects to our power. Whether or not you are able to vote for someone is immaterial, to be honest. Like, you are still represented by the person who is elected to that office. So the issues that they bring up, the issues that they vote on in whatever legislative body that they're a part of, they need to represent you. And so whether that is, I was speaking with my source in Cleveland last night, and the minority leader for their House of Representatives made this excellent point. Like, whether you're talking about stand your ground laws, whether you're talking about clean water here in the state of Michigan, whether you're talking about safe gun laws, whether you're talking about whether or not children should have a right to learn how to read, which is also a problem here in the state of Michigan. All of that is done by people who are elected to office, whether or not children are represented by those elected officials, and they obviously cannot vote unless they're 18. And so it is imperative for us to make sure that the lines are drawn so that we are able to select who is best to represent us, and not the elected officials are able to cherry pick who is going to reelect them to office. It's also important because the access to that elected official, right? So if you're, an example that I use with our members is that former Congressman Will Hurd in Texas, if I'm remembering correctly, had a district that was 800 and something miles long, stretching between San Antonio and Houston, or San Antonio and Austin, one of them two. That's a lot of miles that he has to travel to go meet with his constituents. And of course, we know that Texas has a lot of land, blah, blah. But if I need to be able to access my elected official, I need to access my elected official. And for him not to be able to reach out to me because he has to travel 8-10 hours from one side of his district to another is a mess. And that is directly directly related to how the maps are drawn. I'm sure that they could figure out how to draw his district in a smaller way, particularly with the people that he represents, so that they can have better access to its elected officials. So when a once in a 500-year blizzard comes and knocks out all of your oil, or it knocks off all your power, and so you're freezing to death, you might want to be able to get in contact with your elected official. Especially when your state senator decides to go to Mexico, you might want to get in contact with somebody to help you out. Or like when the companies now are charging you $20,000 for a month of electricity that you didn't use because it was off, like, you want to be able to get in contact with somebody. And that is what redrawing the lines allows you to do, or does not allow you to do. And when the issues in our communities are so grave, like food deserts and lack of transportation, lack of infrastructure, our schools, so many things are impacted upon us in a more grave way than in some of our white communities. It is essential that we are involved with this process from start to finish and litigation, because if we're not, there may not be enough people at the table who are really caring about us. And we have to be able to speak up for ourselves. So yeah, I got a little passionate about that because whatever, it's fine.
Can I add on to something to that real quickly?
You can, and then, but like make it short because I want to make sure we get to audience questions.
So like, it's just like, I totally agree with what you were saying. It's just the other thing to remember is that like, even if like people aren't being nefarious in the redistricting process, like it is essential for minority communities to show up. Like the one story I'm just going to tell really quickly is that in the California Redistricting Commission in 2011, they put 2 indigenous tribes in the same legislative district, right? And so under the California law, the commission draws a draft map and then they go out and have hearings about the draft map. In the draft map, they put these 2 indigenous tribes in the same place because they're 2 indigenous tribes. They probably have the same issues. At the hearing, like at a meeting after they drew the maps, representatives from both indigenous tribes showed up and were like, do not put us in the same legislative district with that other indigenous tribe for like X, Y, and Z reasons. And it was like solely because the indigenous tribe like members showed up and talked about why they didn't want to be together. No one would have had any idea. And I think that's important throughout like the country in terms of making sure you have a seat at the table.
That also goes to like representation, like who is in the California state legislature or who is on that redistricting commission, which also connects to how the districts are drawn so that they can be at the table too, right? So like all of this mess is connected, sorry. Anyway.
No worries. All right, so we have a couple of questions from folks who are watching, so I want to make sure that we get to them. So there, of course, were a lot of words thrown around today because lawyers. I do it all the time, it's fine. What are the words we as the public need to know, and what are the acceptable parameters? For example, what wasted vote percentage is acceptable? And Jack, I'll have you answer that.
I might need to pass the buck on this one. I don't know the standard, I think, as well as some others might.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm afraid to answer because of, there might be litigation around this, but I will say, some people have argued in terms of when it comes to, I saw the question about packing and like, how do you differentiate between like packing people into a district versus just sort of making sure that they have representation? There is scholarship around an argument that, maybe the number is 60%, but like it shouldn't be 70 to 80 to 90% African-American or, any sort of minority community citizen voting age population, right? Like if we're talking about, Campaign Legal Center did a lot of litigation in Wisconsin in the previous cycle. And one of the things we saw was that then Governor Scott Walker and the people that he worked with in the state legislature were okay with making sure that the citizen voting age population in certain places in Milwaukee and in Madison, for example, had these really high citizen voting age populations for African Americans when at the end of the day, it really didn't make sense for it to be high. Like it could have been much lower, and we could have done what Khyla was talking about in terms of having these opportunity districts versus just having, one sort of ensuring that there's only going to be one Black representative for certain portions of Milwaukee or whatever. So.
Thank you. The next question, I'm going to punt back to Jack, so be ready. What are some creative ways the community can engage in redistricting, especially with non-lawyers?
Totally. As a non-lawyer, I'm ready for this one. So I would say, I think a huge part of it is just really drawing attention to the issue. And you can do that in a number of different ways. Some of the ways that we've seen it done are like, these districts look ridiculous sometimes. So it's like, it looks like a duck or like Superman or something, whatever, finding these things, different ways to like put it in front of people, because by and large, people may not know what their district looks like. If you live in a place where your district, as Khyla said, is like 800 miles long, it's helpful to know that it looks like that, and it prevents the sort of adequate representation. There's also like, because the lines can zig and zag, I've seen like gerrymandering 5Ks that run through like 3 congressional districts, because it's like, you can jump all around. So I think bringing it into the spotlight, I would say the only other thing I would say on that is that we know by and large that when people know what gerrymandering is and why it's a problem, they oppose it in huge numbers, and that's across every demographic you can imagine. And so I think it's really incumbent upon folks who have this understanding of gerrymandering and redistricting to take it into the public consciousness, translate it down from the statute to kind of the reality of what the impact is of these unfair maps.
Thank you. Another question is, for the lawyers who are new to redistricting, what are the foundational cases to review to understand the legal framework? And Madiba, I want you to answer that.
Sure. I also just wanted to mention real quick what Jack was saying about the like gerrymandering 5K, because I was thinking at first about running your district, and then I remember that 800-mile district, and I was like, maybe not. So, but as far as foundational cases to review to understand the legal framework, I mean, there are really a bunch. There are some, I guess I'll try to describe some of the genres of cases. There are cases related to redistricting commissions and like establishing that it's okay to have an independent redistricting commission, like rather than just have the government party do it. There are cases relating to race specifically, and like how race has to be addressed and or like not used in making districts. There's like a little bit of like trickiness there in that it's obviously problematic if some map drawer is doing this, like, I'm going to put like all of the Black people here, or like I'm going to put like all of the white people here. So the courts like looked unfavorably upon the sort of like race-centric map drawing. But at the same time, we do want to, at least when I say we, I'm speaking about advocates now, like want to be race conscious and, you know, like not do maps that like perpetuate racism. And I feel like sometimes the colorblind interpretation of the courts can do that. So it's good to review that kind of thing. Let's see. Another genre of case would be definitely relating to what population you use in terms of like doing as the basis for drawing these maps. Like we mentioned, Evan well, and there's another sort of like family of cases that talk about, you know, should we use total population, and why are people trying to deviate from that, and like what makes that unacceptable? I'm a little biased here, but and that it's like not even like what makes this possible, it's like, no, what makes this wrong? So yeah, I guess those are a couple of the examples of buckets of cases. There's a lot of case law on this, which is why it's sort of hard to identify like individual cases, but yeah, there's a lot that you could look into.
Thank you. And then we have one more question. In going back to something that Chris mentioned earlier about just districts, in creating districts, how do you thread the needle between packing, but also ensuring that candidates of choice can actually get elected if voters of color are diluted across districts? This, of course, is the caveat that voters of color are not a monolith who only and always support candidates of color. I mean, I do, but.
Yeah, I mean, like like I always hate saying this as a lawyer, but it's the lawyer's favorite answer of like, it depends, right? Like it just kind of comes down to what that state looks like and sort of what that district looks like, right? Like there's, in California, for example, when the commission is done drawing the maps, they have to explain why they drew the maps in the way that they did. And so for each district, they say, we drew the map this way because like this district is tied together through like some economic thing. And it'd be like, oh, like everyone here in this district, the economic driver is like fishing, for example, around like salmon and that kind of stuff. And so, you know, there's ways to sort of make sure that people are tied together, not just like on the basis of like their race. There are other conversations to be had, right? Like the race isn't the only thing that makes you you, the race isn't the only thing that like ties you to your community, but it can be an important factor. And so there are different things that are happening sort of like simultaneously, like in this conversation about what your electoral district should look like. But I think like ultimately the way you sort of like fight to make sure that the district looks in a way that is fair is that you show up and that you like work with other sort of like in-state partners and other advocacy groups to make sure that it's drawn in a way that is fair, right? Like I think people always kind of ask me like, what is, like, how do you know what is like a fair district? And I always kind of flip it on its head and say like, you know what an unfair district is, right? And so like the one I always go back to is there was a legislative district in North Carolina where they split North Carolina A&T like right down the middle. And so like one half of North Carolina A&T was in one district and the other half of North Carolina A&T was in another district. And also really, I just want to say really quickly that every time I normally tell this story, I have to be like North Carolina A&T, which is a historically Black college or university in the state of North Carolina. And I don't have to do that here. And I'm just really happy to like be able to do that. So like, it's just like, you know that that's unfair, right? That like the people who live, who work and go and attend the university are in two different legislative districts, right? You know that's unfair versus sort of, you just really want to make sure that like your community is brought together. So it's like, it doesn't answer the question, but it's just like, you gotta work for it. You gotta show it. Like, it's not just like a very easy like puzzle piece.
No, absolutely. And I know that there was a couple of comments that were just, you know, for people who may be thinking about running, they have to like wait for the map. Don't wait for the map, just run. There are a lot of politicians that shouldn't be there anymore. So just run, I'll donate to you. With that being said, I want to do two things. One, thank our panelists for being on with us today. This was incredibly informative and I hope the audience got a lot out of it. I would also ask that each of you just provide 30 seconds closing statement with your call to action for everybody who's watching. And I'll start with Madiba.
All right, well, I would also like to say thank you for giving us this time tonight. I'm trying to think about how to use these 30 seconds wisely. Okay, I will direct you to the Brennan Center website. We actually very recently released a pretty comprehensive report on redistricting, and so I think that'll be very useful for folks to take a look over. And also to tune in tomorrow to the HR1 hearing. The Brennan Center president and others will be testifying about HR1 and its importance and all of the great steps it will take to really curb the gerrymandering that is so rampant today. So yeah, that's my advice.
Thank you. And Jack?
Yeah, I want to echo that. Thanks. This has been really, really lovely. So I would say, I think that it can sound really scary and there's a lot of really terrible things that could happen. But I think the positive thing that I take away is that there are groups, as Khyla's identified, all across the country who are working on this already and have been working on it this cycle, last cycle, since time immemorial. And so it's really important, we have the opportunity to get involved with the groups in our jurisdictions that are really fighting to make this better. And I think we should, because this is a hugely important fight.
Thank you. And Khyla?
Also, I would echo the thanks. I would encourage you to follow Delta Sigma Theta, DSTINC 1913 on Twitter, and you can see our Redistricting Tuesdays, or follow the hashtag Redistricting, REDSTRI. I'll put it in the chat because now without the I, it messes me up. But anyway, follow us on Twitter and you can see all of our work on redistricting.
Thank you. And then finally, Chris.
Yeah, I just want to echo everything that everyone else has said. Also, the only additional thing I would add is also to visit the Campaign Legal Center website. We have a democracy toolkit page that has tools for people to figure out ways for them to get active. We recently published a transparency and ethics report in redistricting and sort of giving people some of the language needed to learn how to be make sure that the redistricting process in their state is transparent and ethical. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for hopping on with us. This was a really great panel. I am super proud of myself for finding y'all because, it's important. It's an important conversation to have. And also, you all did a really good job of talking about this without it being partisan, which ultimately redistricting ends up being a partisan endeavor. So thank you so much for providing that overview for people. I'm not sure if Onika is going to get back on before we close, but I wanted, okay, great. I wanted to also make mention that we'll still be doing our redistricting project for the rest of this bar year. So we have more materials coming out. Again, I'm Jennifer Blemur, and I'm one half of the Legislative Affairs team for NBA YLD. My co-chair is Courtney Robinson, who did go to North Carolina A&T, which is why I also knew what it was. So again, thank you to everybody for logging on with us tonight.
Thank you so much. I've been taking notes. YLD takes redistricting seriously. So Jen, Khyla, Madiba, Jack, and Chris, thank you so much for helping us launch our redistricting project, the People's Map. Also, special thanks to past chair Chanel Autry for joining us tonight in the audience. We will be uploading this webinar to our social media platforms. Also, please follow us on our social media platforms for additional redistricting resources, some upcoming events. The National Bar Association is a proud OWN TV community partner. Join us tonight in watching new episodes of Queen Sugar and Delilah, and join us tomorrow on NBA YLD's Instagram page at NBA_YLD for our weekly Delilah debrief. So thank you so much for joining us, and good night.